Hey everyone, Dr. JJ here. Today we're going to talk about dairy. It's one of my five fingers of death, and it's really a lot of people ask me, is like, well, what's so bad about dairy? Does that include my cheese? Does that include milk? What are we talking about with dairy? Why is it so bad? So let's dive into it today. Well, there's three main things that cause the problems, just three, that cause the problems for you if you're dairy sensitive. Now, as a species, humanity has only really been dealing with or eating milk outside of milk from your mother for about the past 8,000 years, meaning milk from other animals, usually milk from cows. And if you are of Northern European descent, we had a gene that turned on about 7 to 9, 10,000 years ago that allows us the enzyme to produce the enzyme lactase, after the age of 6 or so. And what that has allowed us to do is to have more of a famine-based food for those cold Northern European winters. It's really kind of interesting when you look at it as like the entire country of Germany is above the latitude of the whole state of New York. So it's a pretty, in all honesty, the whole continent of Europe is a pretty cold continent. I know you look down in the Mediterranean and you think the warm sandy beaches and everything else like that, but it's relatively cool climate and there can be very harsh winters. So having the milk from another animal, being able to digest that, that's probably a pretty good thing. So, but you know, in today's society, we don't really have that problem. And if you're of African or Asian descent, Native American descent, you never really develop that gene and you don't have the enzyme after your mother's milk. After you wean, we lose it most of the time. So if you didn't have that gene that turned on and stayed on past weaning, then you know what? You can't tolerate dairy very often. Or at least the milk sugars, that's the lactose portion. So let's really break down what milk is for first off. Let's start there before we really dive into this. Milk is designed to take you from infancy, when you cannot fend for yourself, into adolescence. So human milk is designed to take a baby and turn it into a sustainable adolescent. When you start to get teeth and start to fend for yourself, be able to chew your food, that's when you should start weaning, roughly. Then a goat's milk is designed to take a baby goat and turn it into an adolescent goat to where it can go forage for itself. A cow is designed to turn a baby calf into a baby cow. So why would you want to drink something that is going to turn you into a cow? That's just, that logic really never made sense to me once I actually started to think about it in those terms. So that's step number one. But let's dive into why people may be sensitive to it. As we talked about just a second ago, lactose may be one of those things that can cause you to not feel well after you drink it. That's gas, belching, bloating, that's pain in your abdomen, irritable bowel symptoms. It can be as far reaching as things like pain in low back pain, chronic intractable low back pain, maybe in lactose sensitivity. It also could be the other things that we'll talk about too, but it also could be things as far reaching as neck pain, joint pain in general, arthritic pain. We look at food allergy sensitivity specifically based into the dairy allergen. The proteins tend to look a lot like our synovial joints. So the other things, so that's the signs and symptoms of dairy. The ways you can test to see, or lactose, excuse me, the ways you can test to see if you're lactose intolerant is you can actually take lactose sugar and you can do what's called the hydrogen breath test. You can measure the amount of hydrogen on your breath, or you can actually measure your blood sugar after you eat, like say 25 milligrams of lactose powder stirred into water. Drink that pretty quickly. That's about 2 glasses of milk. Which do the powder, because then if your blood sugar doesn't go up, then you're pretty certain that it's because you're not digesting the milk sugar, because milk sugar should raise our blood sugar if it's working right. So that's a couple ways to determine if you're lactose sensitive. You know, my opinion, if you think you're lactose sensitive, do 30 days without it and see if you feel better. If you feel better, then you know, there's your answer. But that's me. So the other things that can happen, there's 2 proteins that can actually be sensitive to. Again, we've talked about this other places, but our immune system actually responds and reacts to proteins and creates antigen and antibodies. So when you get immune system problems, a lot of times, autoimmunity and things like that, it can be in relation to proteins that you've eaten or digested or absorbed is probably more accurate, because the typical reason why we become casein, the two proteins in milk are casein or whey. So you'll see all the whey proteins out there and things like that. Now the whey is typically like what we see in the actual liquid form of the milk. That's the protein in the liquid. The casein is typically what we find in the curds. So that's your cheeses and things like that. Your whey is typically like your ricotta cheese, your whey proteins, things like that. But you know, typically people get sensitive to those two things, and that is usually because of what we call leaky gut, which we'll talk about in another video. When we talk about leaky gut, basically the tight gap junctions have gotten a little bit bigger in our small intestine and we absorb bigger proteins. Now, if you keep in mind, those proteins are what our immune system reacts to. If you absorb those casein protein chains or those whey protein chains, then your immune system may start to react to those. And it can have a lot of far-reaching effects. Again, it can have autoimmune-like problems. It can have other things like joint problems. Again, like we talked about with lactose. So those are typically the three things. You know, honestly, the biggest thing, oh, wait, one more thing. So when you make butter, all you do is you leave the fat, especially when you make a ghee, which is clarified butter, which all the protein and all the sugars are taken out of the milk, and it just leaves the fat. So that's why butter you don't typically have an allergic reaction to. So I do recommend using butter. I know the American Heart Association probably just had a heart attack. Well, kind of a pun intended. But anyway, so use your butter. Butter is safe. It's not considered a dairy. It's just the dairy fat. So that's actually good, and it's good to cook with that. So use that. But as far as everything else, you know, you're better off just getting it out of your diet if you've already weaned yourself off of milk at some point in your life. And most of us weaned ourselves off of milk when we were infants. So once you start to do that, you start to really lose the ability to digest the milk sugars. You start to get the protein sensitivities and things like that. I'm not a fan of whey proteins. I think most of them don't do a body good. I think most of them are kind of irritate the bowel in a lot of different ways. So if you do have the protein sensitivities, what are some of the things you can do? We'll talk about that more in depth at the leaky gut video. But the things you can do, make sure your vitamin D status is up to normal, because that'll help heal the tight gap junctions. Make sure you have a good probiotic. Everybody shouldn't be eating a probiotic. That'll be another video also. But also, you should be getting the prebiotic stuff like resistant starch and inulin, those things that start to build up the intestinal flora and the butyrates that actually make our gut healthier. So those are the things you can start to do. Add fermented food like kimchi or sauerkraut into your diet. That will help tremendously. So all of those things will help pull off of the reaction to dairy. But in my opinion, most of the time, just pull it out. If you tend to react to cheeses, try those steps and see if it helps. That's the best advice I have to you. Is most of the time, you're probably better off without it. But if you absolutely have to have that cheese on occasion, make sure your gut is doing right. And if you have to have that glass of milk, rethink that one. I'm sorry. There's too many other substitutes out there. Just don't use the soy milk, which we'll talk about in another video. So anyway, until then, make your health easy. Get the dairy out of your diet and see how well you feel. Give yourself 30 days, 30 days without it, and see if you do any better. If you do, and you add it back in and you have a reaction, then guess what? You're sensitive to it, and you probably shouldn't be eating it. So make your health easy and get it out of your diet. Until next time, have a good one.